right, we're on page 50. George's friends Bill Hike and Gloria Katz wrote the screenplay, a coming-of-age story about one night in the lives of four young men. The characters were mostly based on different aspects of George's personality. Terry the Toad was the young, awkward George. John was the drag racer. Kurt was the boy who leaves his hometown. The fourth boy, Steve, was the class president. The Ferris gang members also became characters in the movie, and Wolfman Jack appeared in the film as himself. George shot the film quickly over 28 nights. 52, 53. He then edited a version to show to movie executives along with a test audience. The test audience loved it. The studio hated it. "It's unreleasable," a Universal representative said to George and Coppola. "You let me down." George was in shock. Coppola was enraged. "You should get down on your knees. This kid has killed himself to make this movie for you. The least you can do is thank him." Coppola then offered to buy the movie back from the studio. George was devastated at the studio's reaction. He got angry when Universal demanded that changes be made before they would release the film. "They were simply coming in and putting a crayon mark on my painting and saying, 'Hey, don't worry about it, it's just a crayon mark.'" He vowed never to give up control of a movie again. On August 1st, 1973, American Graffiti was finally released. It was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Director and Best Screenplay. The little movie that cost only $775,000 to make earned over $118 million. George was generous with the cast and crew, giving them a percentage of the profits. He himself was now a millionaire, just as he'd promised his father, 2 years ahead of schedule. Chapter 6, That Science Movie, 54-55. When United Artists turned down American Graffiti, they also turned down George's space story, now called Star Wars. They weren't alone. So did every other studio. No one in Hollywood knew what to make of Star Wars. The first sentence of the story treatment was enough to confuse anyone. The story of Mace Windu, a revered Jedi Bendu of Apache who was related to Usby C. J. Thape, Padawan learner to the famed Jedi. Huh? Alan Ladd Jr. at 20th Century Fox encouraged George to edit the story, and they made a deal for Star Wars in 1973. Graffiti was released in August. By November, it was a huge hit, but rather than use his new power to demand more money for Star Wars, George stuck to the original terms of the deal. However, he did request sequel and television rights, and rights to the merchandising, products and toys based off the movie, and soundtracks, music used in the movie. George wanted to control his vision. The studio couldn't believe their luck. What kind of merchandise could Star Wars inspire? They were happy to hand control of those rights over to George. George and Marcia moved to San Anselmo, California. Their Victorian house was also the headquarters of Lucasfilm. While Marcia edited movies for director Martin Scorsese, George worked on his script for Star Wars. It was inspired by the stories he loved as a child and the myths he studied in college classes. Nobody else could write it. 56-57. For 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, George locked himself in his room to write draft after draft on yellow pads of paper. He carried a notebook to jot down ideas. When filming THX 1138, Walter Murch had once referred to a sound tape labeled Reel 2 Dialogue 2 as R2-D2. George gave the name to a droid character. One day, Marcia drove home with their Alaskan Malamute, Indiana, in the passenger seat of her car, inspiring the character of Han Solo's hairy co-pilot, Chewbacca. 58-59. Finally, in March 1976, George was ready to begin shooting in the North African country of Tunisia and in England. The cast were all unknown actors except for British actor Alec Guinness, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi. George planned for the movie to have great special effects, but he wanted to create and control them. So he had hired his own team, led by John Dykstra, and set everyone up in a warehouse in Van Nuys, California. He had named the group Industrial Light and Magic, known as ILM. George had promised Fox he'd try to make the movie for $3.5 million, but imagined it would cost closer to $8.5 million. The actors who played non-human parts often had trouble with their costumes. Actor Kenny Baker kept falling over inside the R2-D2 costume. Anthony Daniels had trouble walking as C-3PO. Peter Mayhew as Chewbacca had to spend 12 hours a day in a bodysuit made of Angora wool and yak hair. 6061. The rest of the cast had trouble with the dialogue. Harrison Ford, who played Han Solo, complained that you could type lines like his, but you couldn't say them. It didn't help that George didn't particularly like working with actors. His direction mostly consisted of 3 phases: faster and more intense, let's do it again, only this time do it better, or terrific. Just before filming began, George changed the name of his hero from Luke Starkiller to Luke Skywalker. The shoot went over schedule and over budget. George was exhausted. He finally finished in July 1976. He visited ILM hoping to see many completed special effects. Instead, ILM had used up half the budget and had completed only 3 shots. That night, George had what he thought was a heart attack. It turned out his chest pains were the result of stress. But he went right back to work, adding the long-awaited special effects from ILM and fixing scenes in the editing room. The studio decided to release That Science Movie in only 32 movie theaters around the country instead of the usual 600 to 800. They were worried that no one would want to see a movie about spaceships, aliens, and robots. On this page down. George was so stressed he didn't even remember the date of the film's premiere. On May 25, 1977, he and Marcia were stuck in a traffic jam on Hollywood Boulevard as they were heading out to dinner. The street was packed with traffic. On the sidewalk, lines 8 people wide stretched around the block. "What's going on here?" George asked, peering at the crowds. Inching closer, he saw all those people were going to Grauman's Chinese movie theater. The movie title on the marquee? Star Wars. Chapter 7. George Lucas Strikes Back. The very next day, George and Marcia went to Hawaii for their first vacation since 1969. They were joined by friends including Steven Spielberg. George and Steven built a sandcastle and talked about George's new idea for a film about an archaeologist who did all kinds of neat stuff. George named him Indiana Smith after his dog, Indiana. The 2 men vowed to make the movie together. Although Star Wars had consumed George's life for over a year, the rest of the world had just discovered it, and they couldn't get enough. Star Wars won 5 Academy Awards, including one for its editor, Marcia. It also won awards for art direction, costume design, musical score, and special effects. George's father was stunned. 66. Suddenly, the deal George made with the studio to retain the sequel rights and most of the merchandising rights seems like genius. George could have let the studio pay for the sequel they now wanted so badly. But studio money meant studio control. He decided to fund The Empire Strikes Back himself. Even with all his money, this was a huge risk. "It has to be the biggest grossing sequel of all time for me to break even," he said. But he did it anyway. When executives at 20th Century Fox demanded to know who would write, star, and direct Empire, George answered, "None of your business." If the movie succeeded, George hoped to build the kind of creative retreat for filmmakers that he and Coppola had dreamed about for American Zoetrope. George decided not to direct Empire himself. That job went to Irwin Kershner. George wrote a rough draft of the screenplay, then passed it on to Lawrence Kasdan to polish it. I'm going to go back. We're going to read Christmas and the Empty Boxes. Christmas 1977, Empty Boxes. No one ever expected Star Wars to be as popular as it is today. In 1977, Kenner, the toy company that had contracted to make the first action figures of the movie characters, could not produce the toys in time for Christmas. They were taken by surprise by the huge demand for Star Wars-themed gifts. The company actually shipped empty boxes to toy stores in time for Christmas. The package came with a cardboard display stand, a few stickers, and an early bird certificate. Kids would fill out their certificates, mail them in to Kenner, and wait months for the action figures to arrive in the mail. The set included 4 figures: Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, R2-D2, and Chewbacca. These early toys were soon joined by many more, but the early bird set had the distinction of being the first Star Wars toys ever, and thousands were sold with just a promise in an empty box. Okay, we're going to go on to page 68, but I'm going to go back and read the sentence we were on. George wrote a rough draft of the screenplay, then passed it on to Lawrence Kasdan to polish it. Page 68. Instead of the hot deserts of Tunisia, the crew shot in snowy Finns, Norway. There were new gadgets and creatures to struggle with. Mark Hamill, who played Luke Skywalker, joked that all his scenes were with robots and puppets. Even though he wasn't directing the movie, George was working long hours. He and Marcia hoped to start a family soon, but right now, didn't have much time to spend at home. Sometimes it seemed as if Marcia was always waiting for George. Skywalker sound, page 70. Sound is 50% of the motion picture experience, George Lucas said. THX 1138 and American Graffiti were both praised for their creative use of sound effects and music. Star Wars sound designer Ben Burtt used many different types of recording to bring George's world to life. R2-D2's voice is a combination of electric beeps, water pipes, whistles, and Burt's own voice. Chewbacca's Wookiee sound is a mix of angry walruses, lions, and camels. The world-famous lightsaber sound effect was created in part by the hum of old movie projectors. Star Wars had created a demand for sophisticated Dolby sound in theaters. In 1987, Sprocket Systems changed its name to Skywalker Sound and invented the THX system, which improved the sound quality in theaters even more. Page 71. ILM was hard at work on the special visual effects. George's sound division, Sprocket Systems, worked on sound. Empire was released on May 21, 1980, and became the most successful sequel of its time. Again, George shared the profits generously with his cast and crew. His professional life was going well, and his family was expanding. In 1981, George and Marcia adopted a daughter, Amanda. Marcia was eager to retire and become a full-time mom. George was eager to get to work on his new movie.